much. Excellencies, participants, ladies and gentlemen. As the Acting Director General of the National Council for Crime Prevention, it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to Stockholm and this 14th consecutive Stockholm Criminology Symposium. This conference has become one of the most well-known annual meeting points for research, practice and policy in the fields of criminal policy and criminology. Criminal policy is in focus on the political agenda, not only in Sweden, but on most countries represented here today. It is therefore a true honor to once again welcome so many participants to this symposium from so many parts of the world. This conference is not only an opportunity for researchers and practitioners to raise questions and address topics in the field of criminology and crime prevention, but also a meeting place where we can network and establish connections for future exchange of research findings and future research. Once again, it's a true honor to welcome you all to Stockholm and to our event. I would also like to address a special welcome to this year's prize winners, the former president of the Swiss Confederation and chair of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, Ruth Dreifuss from Switzerland, and to Professor Peter Reuter from University of Maryland in the United States. We will see a lot of Madame Dreifuss and Professor Reuter during these 3 days. Tomorrow, they will deliver their prize winner lectures, and tomorrow evening, they will receive the Stockholm Prize in Criminology at the prize ceremony in Stockholm City Hall. And they will be the center of attention at the gala dinner following. The awarded works of Madame Dreifuss and Professor Reuters are also the point of departure for the main theme at this year's symposium, research-guided drug policies, and therefore also for the opening ceremony and discussion that will follow on this stage soon. So please everybody, join me in a welcome applaud for this year's winners of the Stockholm Prize in Criminology, Ruth Dreifuss and Peter Reuter. The combination and the responsibilities and activities of BRÅ are in many aspects a mirror of this symposium. Both the agency BRÅ and the symposium comprise a large amount of knowledge based on research and statistics and highlights experiences of conducting operations in practice and on taking policy decisions. As a governmental agency with over 150 employees, BRÅ is an important actor in the field of criminology, crime prevention and criminal policy. We have a large statistical branch that are responsible for, among other things, Sweden's official statistics on crime, with statistics from police-recorded crime to recidivism in crime. We conduct a significant amount of research, primarily on behalf of the government. The studies focus on many kinds of activities and aspects of law enforcement and the criminal justice sector. And we conduct studies on different kinds of crimes and their development over time. We also provide comprehensive support to crime prevention work throughout Sweden and support the prevention of politically motivated extremism. These support activities are prioritized by the government and hence a growing area of operation for BRÅ. In other words, the agency BRÅ and this symposium share the same target groups. We turn to researchers, practitioners, and to policymakers, and get new and higher insights by bringing you all together and meeting you all. It is making us wiser and better equipped for our future work, and I sincerely hope that also holds to be true for all of you here today. We are important one by one, but working together, we're even more able to make a difference in practice. And let us not forget the wider perspectives of the importance of our common task. Young people all over the world are facing disadvantages and challenges, and too many of them are drawn into destructive living patterns and into committing crimes. The crimes in turn create victims of crimes and feelings of insecurity. These feelings of insecurity threatens our mutual trust as well as our societies in general. In this situation, the answer in terms of criminal justice operation, crime prevention strategies, and crime victim support must be well overlooked and considered. We're not naive. We don't think that all problems can be solved by means of a few smart measures or strategies. We understand that crime, victimization, and insecurity and distrust between individuals and groups are elements of any complex society. But we're confident that there are promising roads ahead of us, and that some of many small steps makes it possible to achieve better conditions for individuals and families, better life trajectories, and better terms for communities and for the society as a whole. But these wonderful promises, all these possibilities, can never be realized without reliable knowledge, and can never come true without open and trustful exchange of experiences, views, and ideas. That's why we continue to seek knowledge, and that's why we meet and present and discuss our findings. It is to get wiser, it is to take better decisions, and it is to do better in practice. And my point is that it all starts with the creation of knowledge and with the dialogue between people like us. This symposium is possible because many of you are making presentations that are the actual base content of this event. Without your contribution, this event wouldn't be what it is. For that, we are truly thankful. I therefore would like you all to join me in a second applaud, this time for all of you who are making this event possible. This evening, don't miss out on the poster session and the welcome reception starting at 5 p.m. in the atrium. The event will give you a chance to get familiar with more studies, and not least a chance to network while having a snack and something to drink. Speaking of networking, as we heard, tomorrow there will be a networking lunch, also in the atrium. It should be a good opportunity to meet your colleagues and to talk while having a lunch, a light lunch. And we are much honored that the networking lunch is hosted by BRÅ together with the Global Commission on Drug Policy and the University of Maryland. On Wednesday, the last day of the symposium, this year the yearly lecture will be delivered by Professor Keith Humphrey. Keith Humphrey is a professor in psychiatry and behavioral science at Stanford University. He will be lecturing on the subject, a radical drug policy to reduce crime, arrests, and incarceration. So once again, a warm welcome to this year's symposium, and a genuine thank you to all delegates for sharing your work, participating in discussions, and inspiring future research. I wish you all a rewarding symposium. I would now like to give a special welcome to the Minister for Justice and Migration. The Minister was unable to be present here today in person, but he has filmed a message with greetings to us present here today. I therefore give the screen to the Minister for Justice and Migration, Morgan Johansson.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and honored winners of the Stockholm Prize in Criminology. As Sweden's Minister for Justice and Migration, I am very pleased to welcome you all to this year's Criminology Symposium here in Stockholm. The symposium is a very important forum for the exchange of knowledge in criminology. And thanks to your participation and contributions, the symposium continues to be an internationally recognized and inspiring meeting place. Crime prevention and reduction is a top priority for the Swedish government. Key components of our crime reduction strategy include increasing the number of police officers and introducing new criminal law measures. But, as you all know, that is not enough to ensure success. On the contrary, to be effective, crime prevention must be structured, long-term, and encompass the whole of the society. And that means including key players such as local government, businesses, and civil society organizations. 2 years ago, my government launched a new national program. It was the first national program for crime prevention in 20 years, and it includes both social and situational strategies. The aim is to create better conditions for structured crime prevention initiatives throughout Sweden and at all levels. We are now working on a range of additional crime prevention initiatives, and these initiatives will be launched over the next few years. My aim is to ensure that new policy initiatives, to the greatest extent possible, are evidence-based. I hope that over the next few days you will gain inspiration and more knowledge that can help shape new approaches to preventing and reducing crime in your home countries. I wish you all the best of luck in your future endeavors. Thank you.
Dear friends, colleagues and distinguished guests, we will now turn to a tradition here at the symposium, the opening discussion. The title of the discussion is Research-Guided Drug Policies, Researchers' Advice to Policy, and our chair for the discussion is Angela May. Angela May is an Italian by birth, holds a PhD in statistics, and is the Director of Research in the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. At UNODC, she oversees global, regional, and national research in the areas of drugs and crime. Angela May has 2 decades of experience in the United Nations and is therefore superbly suited for moderating this discussion. It's a privilege for me to give the floor to you, Angela.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. So I will start the discussion this morning by asking Ruth Dreifuss to join us to the stage. Please take a seat. So Ruth is our first prize winner. She is a former member of the Swiss government and president during the year 1999. She's trained in economics and has a background as journalist and scientific expert, and her political career started in the trade unions. She won several national referendums, including one on drug policy based on prevention, therapy, help, and rehabilitation. Ruth is awarded for a vital role in the development of a Swiss drug policy, which was formed out of research findings and monitored and refined out of scientific evaluations. The work included control experiments, where individuals who had failed in methadone treatment programs were offered heroin-assisted therapy. The evidence showed that heroin-assisted therapy greatly reduced the criminality of the clients while improving their health. Heroin-assisted treatment was then adopted as a routinely available treatment in Switzerland, together with other elements of the policy. Welcome, Ruth. Thank you. So now I welcome on stage the second winner prize, Professor Peter Reuter. Please, have a seat. So, as you well know, I guess, Peter is a professor in the School of Public Policy and in the Department of Criminology at the University of Maryland. Peter has been conducting research on drug crimes, drug market, and drug policy, and served as member in several national panels and committees. And I have to mention the generous contribution of Peter to our scientific committee of the World Drug Report that demonstrate the generosity and the commitment to ensure that the world always has the best evidence to make a decision. For over 30 years, most of his research has dealt with alternative approaches to controlling drug problems, both in the United States and Western Europe. Peter is awarded for his long-time work on the relationship between drug policy and crime, by studying the causal pathways through which prohibition and its enforcement influence crime and health. Peter identifies ways of improving outcomes in the context of prohibition and treatment. He has provided clear policy choices to government and police in several countries. Thank you, Peter. Now I want to ask Letizia Paoli to join us on stage. I guess for many of you, Letizia doesn't need an introduction since she's very, she said this is the 10th time that she is here at the symposium. So Letizia is Italian by birth and is professor of criminology at the KU Leuven Faculty of Law, Belgium, and former member of the prize jury for the Stockholm Prize in Criminology. Letizia has been senior research fellow at Max Planck Institute for Foreign and International Criminal Law in Freiburg, Germany. She also served as a consultant to the Italian Ministries of Interior and Justice and the UNODC and UNICRI. Since the early 1990s, she has published extensively on the Italian mafia, organized and serious crime, and on drug control policy. Welcome, Letizia. So let me start this conversation. I'll start with Letizia. During these days, we will focus on knowledge on drugs, drug use, drug markets, drug crimes, and on practices and drug policies. What would you say is the single most important research finding that can help practitioners and policymakers to address drugs?
If you allow me, Angela, I would like to mention the two most important findings so that we can honor both our prize winners. First of all, I think that research has shown that some treatment and harm reduction interventions are effective, that they do work. And this is why we are here today honoring Ruth Dreifuss, because she had the courage to allow and fund in the early 90s an experiment that was certainly risky from a political point of view, but that proved the effectiveness of heroin-addicted therapy. So that's really an important point, and a number of other interventions have also proven to be effective. The second finding is, alas, less upbeat, but still very important. And this second finding is more associated with Peter's work. So Peter has played a pioneer role in delivering this second finding. And the finding is that many supply-side interventions, alas, do not work. They are ineffective, and they're not just ineffective, but they're also harmful. This is what I call the paradox of the contemporary supply-oriented drug policy. Namely, this policy has good aims, wants to improve the human conditions, but by reducing drug production, drug trafficking, and ultimately drug availability, but it fails to reach these objectives, and it both intendedly and unintendedly provoke a lot of harm. It causes unintended harms by promoting large criminal markets, by promoting violence and corruption, and in some countries also mighty criminal organizations. And it also causes unintended harms by imprisoning hundreds of thousands of drug traffickers, and in some countries even drug users, and so on. In some countries even putting these people to death. And by funding, by carrying out upstream interventions such as eradication that cause a lot of environmental harms. And despite the fact that these interventions, these supply-side interventions are ineffective and harmful, they still attract the bulk of drug policy expenditure, whereas interventions with proven effectiveness get much less funding.
Thank you, Letizia. Ruth, from your side, from the policy side, what is the most important research finding?
Well, there are a lot, but I have to choose one. So I would say we know very little about the so-called illegal substances. The whole system is based on a list, a classification of substances, and when we go through, we see strange things. For instance, we see quite less harmful substances at the same level of very dangerous ones. We see that the decision was taken for political reasons, for historical reasons, but they have no real scientific assessment. And because they are at the basis of the control system, we have really to change this. But speaking about that, I am not speaking on pharmacology. I am not speaking only to know what is the content of these drugs, but how are they used, where are they used, who are using them, what are the real harms, who are not just clinical but also social.
Peter, from your side.
So, I mean, Letizia has, of course, stolen a good deal of my thunder by design. I think the critical point is that this is not a field in which there are single studies, perhaps with the exception of the HAT work in Switzerland. There's not a single study that has tended to be very influential. It's a body of research which consistently accumulates. One would like to have sort of breakthrough studies, but this is a diffuse topic and it doesn't work out that way. So I think that the accumulation of research in many countries around the effects of different kinds of control, pointing to the very specific contexts in which you get success and the many contexts in which these interventions fail. I think it's the accumulation of that to the realization that enforcement in particular needs to be highly targeted and context specific. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So I know that we have in the audience practitioners, so I want to ask you a question that maybe can help them. So Peter and Letizia, from your side, let's assume that you want to advise the head of the police in a city like Stockholm, in a city that recently violence is rising relating to drug market, particularly maybe in vulnerable neighborhoods. So how would you advise, Letizia, do you want to say the head of the police, how should he or she structure and lead the police to deal with this?
Well, I would advise him, first of all, to look at what has happened in other cities, both European cities and but also American cities, and their experience shows that you can massively reduce harms, drug-related harm, in particular violence, and public nuisance, even if drug use remains stable. That certainly was the experience of Zurich, but also Frankfurt and many other European cities when they decided to disrupt open drug scenes. So the open drug scenes like the Needle Park in Zurich that were causing so much harm to all the citizens. But also there was a lot of harm for the users themselves, and a lot of violence associated with that. But that's also has been the case in New York. So, for example, there was a book about the New York's experience in reducing harms a couple of years ago, and the author Zimring really was talking about the triumph of harm reduction, because the New York experience shows that the drug-related harms there have consistently and dramatically declined, so there's much less violence than before, even though drug consumption rates have remained stable. And in this respect, I think that policymakers or even law enforcement officials are helped by technology. Namely, nowadays people just order drugs online. So there is much less need to have strict dealing than before. So if you are interested in reducing the harms associated with drug dealing, well, the advice would be, perhaps I'm not sure how well received it might be, but the advice will be, just favor the type of dealing that cause less harms than others.
Well, I would say what is very important is not to let anyone behind, and don't let any neighborhood behind. That means a presence of the police everywhere, but that means also the building of confidence between the police and the population inclusive the drug users, and if possible inclusive the street dealers. I mean, only if there is a confidence relationship, a trust, and the police is not just a repressive force, but also a helping force, as it is written in many books about police, it is possible to reduce the harm and the violence. Our experience was really also through the open scene, which was a bad solution inspired by the police. The police wanted to put everybody in one little place to have free neighborhoods from drug deal in other parts of the city, in better parts of the city, and they have lost the control on the open scene. But the advantage of this bad experience was that we could identify the users, we could identify the dealers, we could rebuild also a contact with the consumers, offering these measures they needed not to be contaminated by diseases, not dying by overdoses. And keeping this contact after having destroyed the open scene was absolutely key. I would say in Switzerland we are probably in contact through public services in a way or in another for, I would say, about 80 or 90% of the drug users. And this makes the scene absolutely different. It makes it different from the petty criminality and from the violence. This, in my view, is the experience of a city where there is no violence or very little violence, and where there is a relationship where the access to services is possible for everybody.
So community policing, a sort of experience of New York and other, yes, Peter.
But in a way, the point you're making is how specific to context the choices are. In Switzerland, you have a set of possibilities that I think are not available to pick a non-random American city, Baltimore. Baltimore is a city with a homicide rate roughly comparable to that of Caracas, and with and much of it drug market related. And the problem that the police face there is very different from that faced in sort of nice bourgeois Zurich. And so I'm very cautious about providing advice, but like Letizia, I say, you need to look around and see what is the specific context, the specific issue that is driving what I take to be the increase in violence. And it may be associated with a particular gang, a particular sort of disruption in supply, and you need to be responsive to that and not just assume that some generic crackdown is what you're after. And Letizia mentioned the shift in how drugs are distributed. I don't think it's so much the internet. I mean, researchers keep looking for evidence that the net is now the way drugs are distributed, and it keeps sort of not being there. One of my favorite New Yorker cartoons is the old one, two dogs sort of sitting at a computer and one of them saying to the other, on the net, no one knows you're a dog. Well, no one knows you're a drug dealer either. So it sounds safe, but no one knows that you're a police officer either. And so the net's not nearly as secure as it looks. The big change is the telephone, the smartphone. Yeah. And it's pretty clear that most street drug markets have collapsed, but not all of them. And I think, as Letizia is right, you want to sort of push the market towards the least harmful configuration, which is likely to be, use Uber. Don't buy on the street. Yeah.
Peter, the instinct sometimes of the police often is, okay, there is a problem of violence, let's increase control. Does it work?
Well, you want to understand the source of the violence, and one thing to say to the police chief is, don't keep blaming yourself. that is, the problem may well relate to failure of other kinds of services. And so, in New York, and shocking how many good ideas come out of that dysfunctional city, but New York City, you have RxStat, which is a version of CompStat, which lots of criminologists and police officials here know, which is an effort to concentrate attention on where problems are getting worse and figuring out why they're getting worse there. In this case, it's focused on drug-related harms. And it's that kind of insight, I think, that's useful to carry forward these things.
Thank you. And Ruth, staying on this providing advice, so since you had this experience as a politician, so assume that you have to advise both the Minister of Health and the Minister of Home Affairs in a country where there is, let's see, a recent increase of violence relating to drug, particularly to supply-driven increase of the market of cocaine, for example. What do you think the Minister of Health and the Minister of Interior should do?
Well, let me be very humble. I don't know what I could really advise, but some elements of my experience might be useful. From the side of the health minister, I must agree that we have far less experience with cocaine as a medical problem than with opioids. We don't know exactly how to help people who are really addicted. We know that many people are consuming cocaine without being addicted and using it as a doping, I would say, for their real professional life. But we don't know how to help really the people, and in this sense, I think a lot of research and experiment are needed to know if substitution can help. I heard about possibility that cannabis could help to bring people out of cocaine consumption, but it is difficult. But I still think that what is very important is not to criminalize the consumption, because you have really to bring the people who are in need to be able to ask for help. Now, for the Minister of Interior, of Police, to fight against international criminal organization, only the international collaboration is possible, and only with the exchange of intelligence information, the common fight against money laundering and corruption are, I think, key. Now, on the local market, you have to try to identify really the lines of the procurement and to be able to stop them. But I think you have some examples also of what can be done in this case.
Since most of what I have to say will be about things that didn't work, let me for a moment come to actually a local example of success. So Sweden had a serious problem of fentanyl distributed, I think primarily carfentanil, distributed by internet. It was a semi-open market. And a prosecutor in this country brought a case against a distributor involving some sort of homicide charge, I don't know exactly what, because customers had died, or a customer had died. And that had a real consequence in terms of cutting back that market by every indicator. The number of fentanyl-related deaths and other evidence of the fentanyl activity showed big declines. It's a reminder that you can probably do something about small markets, about emerging markets, and those are important wins because those small and emerging markets are much more difficult once they become established markets. So I think I have something positive to say on that side. When it comes to the mass markets, I'm afraid we're back to harm reduction of some sort. It's not clear how you effectively interrupt the workings of a well-established and robust distribution system, internationally or nationally.
Thank you. Both, I think all of you speak about harm reduction. And, but, you know, sometimes it's impossible to reduce all harms.
Yeah.
So how do you decide what is most harmful and who decides who's most harmful? So, for example, you know, if you have to decide a policy, whether you have, is it better that you try to have a more, if you want to relax policy in terms of drug use, and then you have maybe a larger population of youth that use drugs, but less people that then become dependent. Or where you have a more, if you want, I would call it maybe not repressed, but controlling system, where you have less young people that use drugs, but then that more addiction later on. And so, and the same from the supply side, you know, you both mentioned, well, you go with a decision that is less harmful, but, you know, how do you decide? What is the priority in reducing the harm? Letizia, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you, Angela. Well, obviously, deciding which harms need to be prioritized is a normative decision. There is no way around it. So harm is itself a normative concept. So I've been doing quite a lot of research on harms in recent years, and for example, I define harm, and together, and I've been doing this work with a colleague, a US economist, Victoria Greenfield. So Victoria and I define harms as violations of stakeholders' legitimate interests. And legitimate interests are those that are recognized within a society as legitimate. So the normative component is there, it's unavoidable. And it's also true that there are different types of harms to different interests. For example, you can have harms to individuals' functional integrity resulting from drug use, but also from violence, and harms to government integrity resulting from corruption. And there is no scientific way alone to decide which harms are more important. So harms, it's a difficult word, but harms are incommensurable. So you're really comparing apples and oranges. But said that, I think that we still miss crucial information about the harms. We would need to know more. For example, harms of drug use, so, that Ruth was mentioning earlier. But more generally, we haven't done yet a systematic assessment of the different harms that are accruing to the different bearers, to individuals, to private sector entities, to public sector entities, and to the physical and social environment. And in my opinion, this is really a crucial task for us criminologists. We have to provide the evidence to policymakers so that policymakers can, on the basis of this evidence, take better normative decisions.
Your view?
Yes, sure. It is the duty of the politician to take the decision of the priority in the action. And for that, we have to build on evidence what are really the problems that touch most people in a most difficult or in a greater sufferance and so on. So it is a process of dialogue with the scientific evidence that can be brought, but also with the public opinion. It is a tentative to rationalize the fears that might exaggerate some harms or the indifference for certain groups of the population that might, in the contrary, say this is not a problem that is our problem, it's just a problem of this marginalized group, and we don't have to work on that. So it is an arbitrage that we have to do. And what is very important is that in this arbitrage, you can enter into a paradoxal situation. You can choose something knowing that it will perhaps be an increase in one harm for reducing another one. So it's not just to choose what you want to do, but perhaps also to choose what you don't want to do. And harm reduction, and I will speak about that tomorrow also, is the typical case where you have a law that in most countries is banning consumption of drugs, and in the meantime you are offering to those who are consuming drugs all what they need to keep safe, to keep alive, and so on. This contradiction is the most difficult arbitrage, because you know that you are in this contradiction and you have to explain it. But for me, it's clearly, I mean, I was health minister and always all my life interested in fighting discrimination inside the society. So it's clear that my point of view is avoid the harms on health and social cohesion.
Yeah, the non-commensurability of harms is an absolutely central problem. I should recognize that across the way in the City Hall, time and again, University of Chicago economists get the Nobel Prize for denying incommensurability and claiming that they can measure everything with money, but they only convince themselves. So the rest of us sort of continue to think that it's very hard to compare a reduction in crime against an increase in addiction, and I think those are genuine paradoxes. So I think you've asked an uncomfortable question. Harm reduction's a lovely banner, and we all fly under it, but then when you get to the details of decisions, it's awfully difficult.
Yeah. Can I move to international policy, drug policy, and maybe start with you, Ruth? When where you have the government of Switzerland, did you try to change or to influence international drug policy?
Well, first of all, I wanted to do what I thought was my responsibility in front of the population of Switzerland. And for this, I had to look what is the margin of possibility I have, keeping our international commitments toward the 3 international conventions on drugs, and work for the health and the safety of the people in my country. The problem was that in that time, I speak about the 90s, the convention were considered more than for a straitjacket than something that would allow experiment, would allow going into innovative measures. So my fight was, in this sense, to enlarge step by step the interpretation of the convention, showing that heroin prescription, safe consumption room, exchange of needles, and so on, drug checking at the disposal of the drug consumers and so on, were all in compliance with the convention. And in this sense, yes, I think I influenced, or Switzerland could influence the interpretation of the convention, bringing them at the margin of what is now considered as being in compliance with the convention. But, what is for me a failure is that I was never able to go beyond the convention, and I think now, in my position as the chair of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, I use this platform to say that something are beyond the convention and must be done, and that is the regulation of the drug markets by the state, by a responsible hand, and not letting them in criminal hands. But I would say, yes, there is a huge movement during the last 20 years with many, many countries making many different experiences and tentative. There was an evolution bringing countries in different ways, and all this, I would say, influenced the international body responsible for drug policy. But it brought also, and I have to tell that, it brought also to a stronger confrontation between what we call hardliners and reform-oriented countries. It is now a situation where there is no longer a real consensus, and where there is a real tension into the international community about the future of drug policy.
From a researcher point of view, as Ruth is saying, the last few years, international drug policy or debate, I would say, has evolved. From your research, has research helped to evolve to get this evolution, or does research influence international drug policy?
The former research director of the Drug Czar's office in the US, when asked that question, said, yes, bad research influences policy. And he was, of course, being ironic, but a certain amount of truth. I mean, there are two problems for drug policy research. One is that drug policy is such a diffuse responsibility, not just in the US, but throughout the Western world. The whole purpose of the Office of National Drug Control Policy was to centralize it, but that quickly broke down when the president lost interest 30 years ago. It's perfectly understandable. And it went back again to basically the Attorney General and his Secretary of Health and Human Services, and even within their agencies there are many different parts. So it's hard to influence a diffuse area of policy making. And the second is that the research in this area is difficult even as compared to criminological research generally. The data that are available give very limited insights. I mean, I don't like to shoot my own field in public, but we do have a problem that we can blame the government for. It doesn't provide us with the data, but the research is not overwhelmingly powerful. And so you put together a consistent line of research, moderate strength, that points in a consistent direction, and say, so that's what should inform your decision. It's not like having a wonderful clinical trial that says, this works. And so the diffusion of the policy making and the sort of limited research possibilities because of the data problems, those are at least two of the problems of using research to influence policy.
Letizia, your view?
Well, I agree with what Peter has just said, and perhaps I would just like to add that I mean, most often drug treatment and harm reduction programs need to be evaluated, to be successfully evaluated in order to get funding, so after the experimental phase, whereas we have a different attitude as society, we have a different attitude vis-a-vis supply-oriented interventions. They are considered, so to say, almost a kind of a moral issue, so we just have to enforce the laws that we have in place. And quite frankly, it seems that many governments and many law enforcement agencies are so far not very interested in really having a thorough independent evaluation of these supply side interventions, and that's probably also why we have such poor data on these issues. But given the fact that these supply side interventions, as I said earlier, attract in most countries way more than the half of drug policy expenditure, and as I said earlier, they seem to be in many cases ineffective and harmful, it seems to me really crucial to start evaluating also these supply-side interventions.
If I might say so, I mean, again, great variations across countries. I mean, not just being nice to my host, but I think this is a country in which criminological research seems to have an important role, as it does maybe in the UK and maybe in the Netherlands, and definitely not in the United States. And they're just, there are long histories that explain this, so that there are countries, I think, in which research can be much more influential on policy, and one should migrate to those countries.
Ruth, you say, well, the debate is becoming more polarized with more hardliner and the soft liner, if you want. But again, the world is complex, and also each country is complex. And there are also countries that maybe you would define a hardliner where actually maybe they have, they address the issue of treatment in a modern way, or there are countries. So it's also hard, to split black and white and to define what can we learn also from the countries, and also more fundamentally, I think that's my personal view when I look at the issue of international drug policy often, and also the research is very much biased to Western countries. So you're talking about there's not less research, but even the little we have is all based on Western countries. And one thing is to discuss, societies are different. They have a different culture, different also way of looking at stigma. But I'm not saying, of course, that stigma is positive, is a good thing, but, it's complex. So what can we learn also from what is happening, and what other countries that maybe they are not considered as, the frontier of drug policy?
You are absolutely right. The countries are very complex, and as I do, that countries who are in the public discussion saying that nothing has to move from the international instrument are changing their internal policy also toward, for instance, public health tools. China, Iran are countries who in the public discussion are blocking, I would say, the opening of new perspective, but in their country they are doing a lot. So you are absolutely right to show this. When I speak about blockade, it is not to negate the different policies of this country, just to say that the international discussion is in a certain way stuck, and that it should be animated, and the acceptance from these different national ways and experiments should be better accepted. And I think this is coming. We had a first step also at the special session 2 years ago in the UN to add new elements in this policy, but now I think we will enter into a period where the country will experiment more and bring together perhaps in 5 years what they are doing, and I hope that at this time the discussion will be reopened.
You mentioned, I think Peter and all three of you mentioned that there are lacks definitely on research. There are certain things that would be nice to know, but we don't know that could help to improve the policy. So what do you think, if you have to choose one issue, let's assume that somebody will give you $1 million to carry out research. 2 million, put the price tag that you want, enough. What would you do the research on? Letizia, do you want to start? That is the most crucial.
That the Stockholm Prize hand over the endowment, not just So what would we do with it?
No, but it's really the biggest gap that we have.
I mean, there's not a single one. So look, there's a massive data problem, and I'm sorry, I will be parochial in this case. So we have in the US, as everybody in this room knows, an extraordinary opioid crisis. Overdose death rates have skyrocketed, probably will continue to grow. Amazingly enough, the US government relies entirely on a household survey of drug use to estimate the number of people who use heroin. Let me say that again. A household survey to estimate the number of people who use an expensive, stigmatized drug. Figuring out better ways of estimating the number of heroin users is just a fundamental starting point for developing good policies. Now, I mean, it's a narrow answer, but there isn't sort of a single project. It really is saying, what do we need to understand the dynamics of this epidemic? Epidemic actually is the wrong word, of this problem, because it's a supply-driven phenomenon, not a demand-driven phenomenon. And there are components that go to that. So I'm sorry, I don't have a big think answer. I have a very data-oriented answer.
Okay. Well,
just given Letizia enough time to think.
Yes,
Right.
I'll comment later on.
Well,
Letizia.
yeah, thank you. Well, probably I have a more grandiose wish, namely, if I could. So I think it would be, in my opinion, most urgent to have a kind of system, in line with what I said earlier, to have a systematic assessment of the harms associated with the different types of drugs, both on the demand and on the supply side. And it seems that this systematic assessment should assess, first of all, what are the harms to the different bearers, the severity, incidence, what are their causes. And that's also important because, especially on the supply side, many harms are a result of our own policy choices. And then this kind of harm assessment should serve as baseline for a thorough policy evaluation. So it gives, so to say, the baseline data for the harms under the current policy regime, and then you could compare it both with what an estimate what the harms would be under an alternative policy regime, and obviously compare it with the cost, with the implementation costs. So my colleague, Victoria Greenfield, and I speak of a notional benefit cost analysis, and we say that it's notional because, unlike the economists of the Chicago School, we do not claim that everything is measurable. So we say that for some data, so some crucial data, we will only have qualitative assessments, so on the basis of ordinal scales, but not a monetary figure. But this seems to me really crucial. It seems to me also crucial in this analysis to see then what are the distributional effects. So because it might be true that the current drug policy regime has had some success in minimizing or in reducing consumptions in Western countries. And probably under a regulatory regime, you would have, at least in the short run, so an increase of drug consumption. But it's also clear that with the current drug policy regime, we are really outsourcing our problems. We are really creating huge problems to transit, to many drug production and transit countries, such as Colombia or Mexico. A country like Mexico is really like doomed to be, so to say, the natural entry points for cocaine, heroin, and many other drugs into the rich US market. So, and I think this kind of analysis is
very helpful.
Important. Yes.
Ruth, from what piece of research would really help to improve drug policy?
Yes, as Letizia just spoke about the necessity to know exactly the substances, their harms from the demand side and the supply side is what I tried to say at the beginning, that the classification of the substances should be assessed seriously, and also the question why some of the psychoactive substances are legal and other illegal, and what are the consequences of this difference. I mean, if you make a classification, alcohol would be very high, higher than many of the substances that are now considered as illegal drugs. But for me, I think for the future, most important would be to evaluate experiments and to think also from the theoretical point of view, and taking examples from other markets, how to regulate in a rational way the markets and the production of these different substances. I think the future has to be to put all that in reasonable and well-thinking hands, like those we hope the state has.
Before I go, I wanted to comment on the survey, and indeed, I think there is a massive underreporting of drug use in general, and the drug use surveys is incredible all over the world, not only in the US. But that's where we hope we have doing some experiment in developing countries to improve the measurement, and so it would be maybe a case where in developing countries we have better measures than in countries like the US. But we have now 10 minutes, and I want maybe to go more to finish with something more personal, relating to maybe your career and how you came where you are. And maybe, Peter, when do you decide to get into the issue of drugs?
So, I mean, I have often thought about the fact that someone as bourgeois as I, and as lacking any prurient interest in either drugs or organized crime, have spent my career studying drugs and organized crime. And of course, it's a series of accidents. Since I have a couple of minutes, I will actually give a detail. So I was research director, an accident, of a federal advisory commission on gambling. And I was sort of in my graduate studies in economics, and the FBI said the mafia controls gambling. Well, I had done industrial organization in graduate school, so I knew that meant they could restrict entry and control price. So I said, so how do they restrict entry and control price? They say, no. They run gambling. And after a while, I realized they did not know of what they spoke. And that got me interested in whether there was a way of actually figuring out who, if anyone, controlled gambling. And that was interesting, but there wasn't anyone to talk to. And then it was clear that drugs, this was the early 80s, that drug markets and drug problems were a serious issue, and there might be more people to talk to if I focused on that. So I rather opportunistically decided to switch from illegal gambling to illegal drugs. And it's turned out to be sort of fascinating. I read a lot of history, and I love the fact that every now and then our topic relates to sort of the big events of recent history. And why is I mean, everyone thinks Afghanistan has been producing opium forever. Not so. Basically, it was a very marginal producer until two big events happened. The Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And suddenly there was, Iran had been producing enough for its own users under the Shah. That came to an end. In Afghanistan, central government lost control, and there really was little else to do in many of the provinces except grow opium. And these two things came together. Wow, terrific. So now I'm connected to the big events of the world. So I've just found drug policy and drug markets endlessly fascinating. Methodologically, almost everything is useful here, and it engages a sort of general social curiosity. So there we are.
Interesting. I have the same experience. I've done statistics research and many things in social statistics, but drugs is the most fascinating because indeed there is so much still to do.
Right.
But as a researcher, you always have. Letizia, I want to ask, first of all, how do you choose the teams of your research? And also, again, what I find in research and drug policy in general, and drugs in general, is that because there is this moral approaches and sometimes polarization. You know, people feel that if they are conservative, they have to be on one side. If they are more liberal, they have to be on another side. And so sometimes it's hard also to keep the research unbiased, to keep impartial, and not to get into the trap of, you know, wanting to show one side or the other. So how do you go about it in your research?
That's a difficult question, isn't it? Well, I think I have a kind of a paradoxical answer to that. Namely, my approach to this dilemma has been to to embrace normativity. Namely, to say, I plea from harm reduction. So, and harm, as I said, it's a normative concept. Harm reduction is also a normative goal. But said that, I think that this makes me agnostic, so in terms of specific interventions. So I have no vested interest in different types of interventions, and I have, I think, at least some methodological expertise and tools to evaluate as objectively as possible the different interventions and to see which interventions are most effective in reducing harms and then which type of harms. And I like very much in this respect the position of, so in all the sociologists that perhaps only the most senior people in the room will remember, so namely Alvin Gardner, who said that you can combine partisanship and objectivity. So he said, in the same way as a physician does, the physician is also committed to health, to the health of the patients, and still so he's committed also to objective diagnosis and then to choosing, picking up the most effective interventions. And that's a bit my approach, so in this field. So that's how I deal with the dilemma that you mentioned.
Ruth, from the policy side, I think when you made a decision as a politician in Switzerland to make a change, a fundamental change in drug policy, I think sometimes politicians are scared to speak about drugs or to take a firm position because of this polarization among the people, and then you lose consensus on one side, you may gain on another. So as a policymaker, when you made that decision, what did you lose and what did you gain?
Well, let me begin with my personal encounter with drug policy. I mean, I was always interested. I am also a social worker from profession, so it's a long history. But the responsibility to be a health minister in Switzerland in the time of the peak of the AIDS epidemic was normally for me the step to drug policy. One of the source of the epidemic was the injecting of drugs with material that was not clean, what was shared between the drug users, so that it was just obvious that I had to enter in this. And when I say enter in this, it was really enter in this. It was going in the open scene, it was meeting with the people, it was looking in the experience that we did, and in this sense it was for me clear that what I had to explain to be able to put the bill through the process of decision was to explain that what was proposed was working better than the situation, that we could curb the epidemics, that we could curb the petty criminality with many, many measures, that we could bring the people off the open scenes, but without losing their contact, and to say, look, my dears, we are choosing the middle way, the rational way. We are not extremist on one side and not extremist in the other. So that in all the ballots I had, in all the campaign, I knew always that 1/3 was against my proposal. But it was not always the same third, so that I had always 70% of majority for these proposals. And but I share your impression of all. Drug policy is a domain when you enter by one door, you find an immense complexity, and speaking about health brings you to speak about the neighborhoods where the deal is taking place. You are speaking about the dealers. You are even speaking about migration. You are speaking about urbanism, I mean how the city is built. You are speaking about everything through drugs. So even if the problem was a problem I didn't choose, I was chosen to continue on that.
Yeah. So we have just a few minutes. I want to ask maybe each of you, if, what would you like to say now? We have an audience of researchers, practitioners, policymakers. So maybe, Ruth, from a policymaker, what would be your advice to researchers on how to better, influence policy? And maybe for the two researchers, what would be your 1 minute or 1 minute advice to policymakers to make them more sensitive about the evidence base? So, who do you want to start? Peter.
Okay, so I think I go back to the question of who makes the decisions. I think all of the important decisions about drug programs have implications for other agencies, and so don't do it on your own. You do want to have a coordinated response. Complicated, but that gets you to look at multiple aspects of the problem, which will be disturbed by whatever it is you do. And so that's it.
Yes, I would like to use my 30 seconds to address my colleagues, criminologists, namely, I would like to invite them to recognize more than they've done so far that also crime is a normative concept. So that's something that especially kind of many positivist criminologists would like to forget. But I mean, crime is the concept that our societies use to define the things that we consider bad, that we consider wrong, harmful. And therefore, I think that even if we strive for objectivity, I think that we should recognize more the unavoidable moral basis of our endeavors.
Ruth.
Well, I follow on Peter. It's not only the decision making between the different agencies that should be coordinated, but it is also on the ground. I mean, I would say in Switzerland what we could achieve was only possible when the professional in medical services, the social worker, the policemen at the street corner accepted to collaborate, to understand each other, and not to jeopardize through their intervention the needed intervention of the others. Having, for instance, a safe consumption room needs the collaboration of the police. The police has to accept to protect something that is, in fact, against the law. And they have to be sure, and in some countries we know that policemen, for instance, arrest people when they come to exchange syringes or to find services because they are in need of support. I mean, it is only when all these professionals agree about the complexity and the necessity of different approaches that the change can be really realized on the ground.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was very helpful. And then I want to invite everyone to thank you for the interesting thoughts. And congratulations again for your prize. So now we know who we need to thank, that committee on gambling.